So firstly, I wanted to start by looking through some of the eminent personalities which made up the US-sponsored Democracy Summit. Well, we saw President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who is presiding over millions of people on the streets of France, protesting against his anti-human policies in many ways. You also have, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, that well-known Democrat, who is involved in the crushing of Palestinians, both physically and spiritually and politically. And also, of course, we know that Netanyahu is currently drawing the ire of almost 1 million protesters on the streets of the political unit of Israel. Another interesting participant in this Democracy Summit is, of course, the CEO of YouTube, Neil Mohan. Now, how can we forget that it was just a year ago or so that Google announced that it deleted more than 2,500 YouTube channels, supposedly for ties to China, as part of its effort to weed out disinformation. However, when it was pressed a little bit further on what the content of these channels was, it said that the channels generally posted spammy, non-political content, but a small subset touched on politics. So basically, 2,500 YouTube users were banned from the channel because they may have been Chinese. Sounds pretty racist to me and not very democratic. Now, if we look at some of the examples where the United States has attempted to spread democracy, how could we not start with Afghanistan? This was an invasion and occupation by NATO, which produced 5.3 million refugees. That is a quarter of the Afghan population. It left 72% of the society in poverty and actually rendered Afghans statistically the saddest people in the world. And following the US humiliating defeat in Afghanistan, it decided in an act of petty spite to freeze $9.5 billion worth of assets of the Afghan Central Bank. Before the US invasion, opium production in Afghanistan was almost zero. Today, following the occupation and just before the withdrawal, we found that over 90% of the world's heroin originates in Afghanistan. And of course, this is an audience that we would not have to explain the 3 opium wars, which the British aimed at China. Of course, Helmand was the center of opium production in Afghanistan, and the British Army had almost 10,000 soldiers there on 140 bases throughout the occupation. We also have the example of something else the US brought to Afghanistan, which is DynCorp, a security company that enjoyed as its parent company Veritas having the Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage on its board. This company was revealed by WikiLeaks to have actually hired child slaves, sex slaves in Afghanistan. Also, Armor Group. This was a US security company now owned by G4S, which was employed to guard the US embassy. It was found by the US government to have violated the Trafficking Victims Protection Act by visiting brothels in Kabul while it was working at the US embassy. Now, in stark contrast to that, what has China brought to Afghanistan? Well, in 2011, it signed a 25-year deal with Afghanistan with investment of $400 million in the short term and overall believed to be generating $7 billion in revenue for Afghanistan for the extraction of oil. We also know that while the United States is freezing the assets of Afghanistan and sanctioning it into a state of suffering and starvation, in many cases we have seen, actually China has come along with a 25-year-long deal, which sees initial investment of 150 million and long-term investment of 540 million into Afghanistan. What did US democracy bring Iraq? Well, this was a war that 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations protested against globally. In the very first month of the occupation, the US dropped 29,000 bombs on Iraq. It was an occupation that displaced 1 in 25 Iraqis and killed over 1 million people. And what do we have? We have in Fallujah, one of the worst affected areas, a 38-fold increase in leukemia. And as Noam Chomsky has pointed out, that is larger than the cancer rates in Hiroshima. Since the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US has spent $32 million per hour on war. And what do we have to speak to us about Fallujah in US culture? You have computer games like 6 Days in Fallujah, where the game player is put in the position of a US soldier killing Iraqis. You have the US military naming a warship after Fallujah. And so what we saw throughout the war on terror was the death of civil liberties within the US and Britain. We saw the death of the Magna Carta and the understanding of habeas corpus in Britain. We saw Guantanamo Bay, and we saw 46 bombs per day dropped by the US and their allies for 20 years, and overall the displacement of 37 to 59 million people. Well, when we compare that in Iraq, what is China bringing to Iraq? So China in the last few years has signed a deal to build 8,000 schools in Iraq. The initial deal will build 1,000 schools. And what we also know is that the United States, in comparison, throughout its entire occupation of Iraq, built 17 new school construction projects and only 94 school renovations. This is not comparable. When we look at Africa, we see even in the last year or so, US trained officers leading 7 coups. And since 2008, we've seen 9 coups in 5 countries led by US trained officers in Africa. What has the US brought Africa but the killing of Patrice Lumumba? And even you see British troops stationed in Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Mali. And still the United States, through its AFRICOM program, which African nations refused to allow to be headquartered in Africa until the Obama presidency, you've seen around 35 US military bases in Africa across 15 countries. What has China brought to Africa? Well, China has been Africa's largest trading partner since 2009. From 2000 to 2020, we have seen China assist Africa in the building of 13,000 kilometers of roads and railways. We've seen it fund over 130 medical facilities and around 50 sports venues. And in fact, during the period of COVID, China actually cancelled the debt of 15 African countries. And we saw by the end of 2020, direct investment by Chinese companies surpassing $43 billion. There are 3,500 Chinese companies active in Africa, and more than 80% of their employees are local people. We also know that in 7 months alone, China imported $70 billion worth of African exports. We also know that between 2016 and 2020, the total investment in infrastructure projects across Africa, which were carried out by China, reached $200 billion. And in fact, those infrastructure development projects account for 31% of all infrastructure projects on the African continent in that year. We've seen over 1,000 bridges built. We've seen over 100 ports built. We've seen 10,000 kilometers of railways built, almost 100,000 kilometers of highways built. You have currently 1,000 Chinese medical experts present in Africa. And over the last 50 or so years, you've seen 23,000 Chinese medical team members sent to Africa, and the claim is that they have treated 230 million patients. And so what is the new stage that is upon us, and why is the United States doing all of this, all of these theatrics? Well, it is about the inevitable process of de-dollarization. Of course, we know that when the US imposed sanctions upon Russia, Russia made a very wise move by saying to the nations involved in this that they would have to pay for their fuel purchases in rubles. But this process of de-dollarization was already something that was in the works, because of course in 2015, of the bilateral trade which existed between China and Russia, 90% of it was carried out in dollars. And by 2020, that had already fallen to 50%. We also know that the IMF has seen this coming in the wind. And of course, you have the new Minister of Finance in Brazil, Fernando Haddad, championing the idea of the creation of a new South American currency called the SUR. When we look at the Middle East more widely, and we think about all the United States has put into promoting sectarianism and an antagonism between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we are talking about billions put into promoting these fissures within the society there. For China to take the role it has to bring these two sides together to solve the war in Yemen, which has been responsible for so much human suffering that both the British and the US were deeply invested in. This is a fantastic move, which will be welcomed by millions of people across the region. And so what you see is indications from Saudi Arabia that they will accept other currencies rather than dollars for the oil that it sells to China. When we look at BRICS as a movement, you've seen another Brazil connection in Dilma Rousseff, somebody who the United States no doubt had involvement in overthrowing in Brazil, being selected as the next leader of the BRICS Group New Development Bank. Now, this organization is formed as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, who through their structural adjustment plans have wreaked such havoc across the global South. And now the BRICS are working towards the creation of a reserve currency that can be made up of the different currencies of the main members. Now, at present, these 5 members of the BRICS make up 30% of the world's total land surface and 41% of the population. But their collective GDP by 2030 is projected to reach half of global GDP. We also know that there is, with the addition of Iran and Argentina, which seems very, very likely, their current cut of the world GDP, which is 31%, will rise to 33%. And then if we take Iran and Argentina together into the BRICS, you would see them accounting for 26% of global oil output, for 50% of iron ore production, and 40% of global corn production, and 46% of global wheat production. There's also more exciting possibilities with new potential BRICS members such as Afghanistan, Egypt, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. We've also seen the adding of organizations like the UAE to the BRICS banking branch. But what is this all about, this escalation in war towards a force which is seemingly only looking for global cooperation? Well, the United States has military bases in 5 countries surrounding China, from Singapore to Australia to Nepal, and formerly in Afghanistan. The United States has 400 military bases around China. And what is the reason for this escalation? Well, in 1978, the Chinese economy was worth only 5% of the US economy, and 80% of the population lived in poverty. At that time, 2/3 of the world economy was represented by the developed world, and the global South only represented 1/3 of the global economy, despite having 85% of the world's population. Well, since then, for the next 40 or so years, the Chinese economy has grown around 10% a year. And when we understand that, along with the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, none of them being European, and several of them are former British colonies. And when we also consider that Britain is on course to fall from the 5th largest economy to the 11th in the next decade or so, when we take into account that Britain's exports, it has more exports to Ireland than it does to all of the BRICS nations combined, it's very likely that Britain will be returning to a point of that it was at the foundation of the East India Company, where it produced just 1.8% of the world GDP. And when the East India Company's traders had to learn Farsi in order to beg from the Mughals for favors. Britain is becoming a quaint sock puppet, constantly gesticulating with farcical delusions of grandeur, seeking to speak far beyond its means and its ability. Will the Anglo-Saxons be forced to swallow their tongues and undergo a process of Wimbledonization, a term known in Japanese and Chinese, but not so much in European languages? 400 years of European dominance will soon become the subject of historical curiosity. Thank you.